My husband left me alone in a hospital bed hours after I gave birth, and when his mother told me I wasn't good enough to raise my own baby, he didn't say a word to defend me. That was the moment I understood something was terribly wrong. I was still wearing the pale blue hospital gown from Parkview Regional Medical Center in Fort Wayne, Indiana. My hair was pulled into a loose knot, my feet were swollen, and every part of me felt exhausted. But I was holding my daughter. Emma was asleep against my chest, wrapped in a white hospital blanket with tiny pink stripes. She was so small that one of her hands disappeared inside the fold of the blanket. I kept looking down at her because looking anywhere else felt harder. My husband Richard had left sometime around 5 that afternoon. He had said he needed to clear his head. I thought he would come back. Instead, his mother and his younger brother showed up. Patricia Mercer was 79 years old and had never been a woman who asked permission before speaking her mind. She walked into my hospital room carrying a large handbag and wearing the same beige coat she'd worn to church that morning. Greg came behind her. He looked at me, then at Emma. Neither of them smiled. Patricia pulled a chair closer to my bed. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. I was too tired to argue. "What do you mean?" She glanced at Greg. Then she looked directly at me. "You have to understand that this baby is a Mercer." I stared at her. "She's my daughter." Greg gave a short laugh. Patricia leaned forward. "You're not good enough to raise that baby." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. The room seemed strangely quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitor beside my bed. I looked toward the door. "Where's Richard?" Patricia didn't answer. Instead, Greg said, "He agrees with Mom." I felt my fingers tighten around Emma's blanket. Richard agreed, "My husband, the man who had held my hand during every ultrasound, the man who had painted the nursery a soft yellow because he said pink was too predictable, the man who had stood beside me when the doctor told us we were having a baby after years of believing that probably wouldn't happen. He agreed that I wasn't good enough to be her mother." I looked down at Emma. She made a tiny sound in her sleep. I lowered my voice. "Why are you saying these things?" Patricia sighed as if I were being difficult. "Because somebody has to think about the child's future. I am thinking about her future." "Are you?" Her question landed harder than it should have. I hadn't slept properly in almost 2 days. My body hurt. My emotions were all over the place. I was scared, tired, and still trying to understand how my life had changed in one afternoon. But I knew one thing: I wasn't handing my baby to anyone. Patricia folded her hands over her purse. "Richard told us you're overwhelmed." I looked at her. "He left me here. He needed some space. He left his wife who had just given birth." Greg shrugged. "That's not what we're talking about." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead I said, "Then what are you talking about?" Patricia told me the Mercer family could provide Emma with stability. They had money. They had a large house. They had people who could help. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. "We think Emma should stay with us for a while." "No." Patricia blinked. "You should at least consider it." "No." Greg leaned against the wall. "You don't have to make this difficult." I looked at him. "I'm not making anything difficult." Patricia's expression hardened. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Maybe she was right. At that moment I didn't understand. I only knew that something had changed. 6 months earlier, Richard and I had been sitting at our kitchen table eating leftover lasagna from Kroger when he had joked about becoming grandparents one day. Then I had shown him the pregnancy test. He had stared at it for several seconds before looking at me. "Are you sure I remember laughing?" I took 3. He had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. For months, he was wonderful. He came to appointments. He assembled the crib. He kept a list on his phone of things we needed from Target. But sometime during the final months of my pregnancy, he changed. He started visiting his mother more often. He began taking phone calls outside. If I walked into the room, conversations stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. Pregnancy makes you worry about everything, I thought. Now, sitting in that hospital bed, I wasn't so sure. The door finally opened. Richard walked in. He looked tired. But he wasn't looking at me. He looked at Patricia, then Greg, then Emma. "Can we just get this over with?" he said. My heart sank. "Get what over with?" Richard rubbed his forehead. "Diane, don't turn this into something it doesn't have to be." I stared at him. "You left me here. I needed some time." "You didn't call. I was with Mom." Patricia reached over and touched his arm. "We're trying to help you." I looked at Richard. "Do you believe what your mother said?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. Finally, he said, "I think you need help." I looked down at Emma. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I noticed something. Richard wasn't looking at me like a husband. He was looking at me like someone who had already made a decision. And suddenly, the strange conversations, the secret phone calls, and his sudden interest in my father's old paperwork began lining up in my mind. There was something they hadn't told me, and whatever it was, I had a feeling it had nothing to do with Emma's well-being. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply held my daughter a little closer and listened. Because for the first time in my marriage, I realized that staying quiet might be the smartest thing I could do. The next morning, Richard did something I never thought he would do. He didn't come to the hospital. Not at 8. Not at 10. Not even when the nurse told me I was ready to leave. Instead, Patricia arrived with a garment bag over one arm and a paper cup of coffee in the other. "Richard's handling some things," she said. I looked at her. "What things?" She set the coffee on the little table beside my bed. "Family matters." I almost smiled at that. My family was sitting in this hospital room with me. My husband was somewhere else. The nurse came in a few minutes later with my discharge papers. She explained the instructions carefully, reminding me to take it easy, keep my follow-up appointment, and call the doctor if anything seemed unusual. I listened, nodded, and signed where I needed to sign. Patricia stood behind me the whole time. When we got downstairs, I expected Richard to be waiting by the entrance. He wasn't. His silver Ford Explorer was gone. Patricia's Buick was parked in the pickup lane. She opened the passenger door. "You can ride with me." I looked down at Emma's carrier. "Where are you taking us home? Who's home?" She gave me a look. "Yours, Diane." Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable. Still, I was exhausted. So I got into the car. The drive back to our house on the north side of Fort Wayne was quiet. Patricia talked about traffic, the weather, and how cold the hospital had been. She didn't mention Richard once. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it before leaving for the hospital. Patricia walked inside first. I followed with Emma. The house smelled like coffee and the lemon cleaner I used every Saturday morning. Everything looked normal. Until I reached the nursery. The crib was empty. The changing table was still there, but several drawers had been opened. A stack of diapers sat on the floor. "What's going on?" I asked. Patricia didn't answer. Greg stepped out of the hallway. I hadn't even known he was there. He looked at the baby carrier. "She's here." I stared at him. "Why are you in my house?" Richard gave me a key. My hand tightened around the carrier handle. "Why?" Greg shrugged. "Emergency." I looked at Patricia. She avoided my eyes. Then she said, "We thought it would be easier if Emma stayed with us for a few days." "No." Patricia sighed. "You're still emotional." I said no. Greg walked toward the nursery. "We already talked about this." "No, you talked." I said no. He stopped. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Patricia said quietly, "Diane, don't make us involve attorneys." I looked at her. "Are you threatening me?" "No. I'm warning you." That was when I realized something. They had planned this. Maybe not every detail, but enough of it. They weren't visiting a new mother. They were testing boundaries. I carried Emma into my bedroom and closed the door. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking. I looked at my daughter sleeping in her carrier. "I don't know what they're doing," I whispered. Of course, she didn't answer. She just stretched one tiny arm and went back to sleep. I sat there for almost 10 minutes. Then I remembered the envelope. 3 weeks before Emma was born, I had been cleaning Richard's desk because he was away on a business trip. I wasn't snooping. At least that's what I told myself. I had been looking for a copy of our insurance information. Instead, I found an old folder with my father's name on it. My father, Thomas Whitaker, had died 8 years earlier. He hadn't left me a fortune. He had been a practical man who owned a small machine shop outside Fort Wayne. After he died, I received some money from the sale of the business and a modest investment account. Richard had always known about it. But I had never mixed it with our household finances. The account was mine. My father had made that very clear. Inside the folder, I had seen several pages I didn't understand. There were words like beneficiary trust and distribution. I didn't think much about it then. Until I remembered what Richard had said one night. He was sitting at the kitchen table staring at his phone. "Your father's money," he said casually, "is still sitting there, right?" I looked up. "Some of it." "How much?" "Why?" he shrugged. "I was just asking." I didn't answer. Now sitting on my bed with Emma beside me, I suddenly wished I had paid closer attention. I picked up my phone. There was one person I trusted who might know what those papers meant. Margaret Hayes. She had been my father's attorney for years. I found her number in my contacts. My thumb hovered over it. I hesitated. Calling a lawyer felt serious. It meant admitting to myself that this wasn't simply a family argument. This was something else. Then I heard Patricia's voice outside my bedroom. "She'll give in eventually." Greg laughed. I pressed the button. Margaret answered on the 4th ring. "Diane." My voice cracked. "Margaret, it's me." "Oh, honey, how are you?" I looked at Emma. "I'm scared." There was silence on the other end. What happened? I told her everything. The hospital, Richard leaving, Patricia's demand, Greg entering my house, the threats. Then I told her about the folder. Margaret became very quiet. Finally, she asked, "Did Richard ever tell you why he was interested in your father's trust?" I sat up straight. "You know about that, yes." My heart began pounding. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a breath. "Diane, listen carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't give anyone original documents. And most importantly, don't let anyone take Emma anywhere without your permission." I glanced toward the bedroom door. "Margaret, what is happening? I need you to come to my office." "Today?" "Yes." "Why? Because there are documents your father left that you need to see." I swallowed. "What kind of documents? I'd rather show you." I looked down at Emma. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt something besides fear. I felt a small cautious sense that maybe I wasn't as trapped as they wanted me to believe. Margaret continued. "And Diane, yes, don't tell Richard you're coming." I looked at the closed bedroom door. Outside I heard Patricia laughing with Greg. "Why not?" "Because I have a feeling Margaret said that your husband doesn't know everything your father left behind." I ended the call. For several seconds I just sat there. Then I looked at Emma. "Okay, sweetheart," I whispered, "let's find out what your grandfather knew." I packed a small diaper bag, not because I knew what was coming, but because for the first time I was preparing to find out. Margaret Hayes's office was in a quiet brick building off DuPont Road about 15 minutes from my house. I got there just after noon. Emma was asleep in her carrier and I was running on maybe 3 hours of broken sleep. I had a diaper bag over one shoulder and a folder of hospital papers tucked under my arm. I almost turned around twice. Not because I wanted to go home, because I was afraid of what I might learn. Margaret was waiting near the reception desk. She was in her early 70s with silver hair cut short and the kind of calm voice that made you feel like she had already handled every possible disaster in Indiana. She hugged me gently. "Come on in." Her office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She closed the door behind us. "How are you holding up? I don't know." That was the honest answer. She nodded. "You don't have to know yet." I sat down. Emma stirred in her carrier. Margaret looked at her and smiled. "She is beautiful. Thank you." Then Margaret walked to a filing cabinet. She pulled out a thick brown folder. When she placed it on the desk, I recognized my father's handwriting on the label. My stomach tightened. What is that? Something your father prepared years ago. She opened it. There were several legal documents inside. I saw my name, then Emma's. I stared. Emma wasn't even born when these were written. I know. Margaret turned a page. Your father planned for the possibility that you would have a child. I frowned. He did. He was a careful man. That was putting it mildly. My father kept receipts for 10 years. He once drove 40 minutes back to a hardware store because they had charged him 12 cents too much for a box of screws. Margaret smiled when I told her that. Yes, that sounds like Thomas. Then her expression became serious. He created a family education trust. I looked at the papers. What does that mean? It means certain assets were placed in a structure designed to benefit your future children. The money isn't yours to spend however you want, and it isn't Richard's either. I looked up. Richard can't touch it. No. I felt my shoulders drop slightly. Margaret continued. Your father specifically included protections against a spouse gaining control through marriage. I stared at her. Why would he do that? She gave me a look. Because he knew your husband. I didn't like hearing that. Did my father not trust Richard? Margaret hesitated. Your father was polite to him. That answer said enough. I looked down at the documents again. There was another page. My father's signature was at the bottom. Margaret tapped it. He wanted this protected until your child reached adulthood. I swallowed. So this has nothing to do with Richard. Correct. And Patricia can't control it. Correct. Then why are they suddenly interested? Margaret closed the folder. That is the question. She opened another file. This one was thinner. Inside was a printed email. I recognized Richard's name immediately. My hands went cold. What is that? An email your husband sent several months ago. I read the first few lines. Richard had contacted Margaret's office asking about the trust. He wanted to know whether the assets could become available to the marital household after the birth of a child. I looked up. He contacted you, yes. When? About 4 months ago. I couldn't speak. 4 months. I remembered exactly where I had been 4 months earlier. At home, painting the nursery, buying tiny onesies, making lists of baby names. While I was doing all that, my husband was asking a lawyer how to get around my father's trust. Margaret watched my face. Diane, there's more. I looked at her. She reached into the folder. He didn't send the email to me. I frowned. What? He sent it to another law office. I waited. He put the wrong email address in the message. For a second, I didn't understand. Then Margaret said, he accidentally sent it to an attorney in our building. I stared at her. You're kidding. I wish I were. Despite everything, a small laugh escaped me. It was the first one I'd had since Emma was born. Margaret smiled. He apparently typed one letter incorrectly. I shook my head. Richard spent months acting like he was planning some secret financial operation. And then he couldn't type an email address correctly. That's about the size of it. I laughed again. Then the humor disappeared. Because the email wasn't funny, not really. It showed intent. He had been thinking about my father's money long before he started talking about my ability to raise Emma. I leaned back. So this wasn't about me being overwhelmed? No. It wasn't about Emma needing stability? No. It was about money. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said money was certainly part of it. I stared through the office window. Cars moved along DuPont Road. People were going about their normal Friday afternoon. Someone was probably buying groceries. Someone was picking up a prescription. Someone was complaining about traffic. And my entire understanding of my marriage had just shifted. I thought about every conversation I'd had with Richard. Every time he'd asked about my father's investments. Every time he'd said, "We're married, Diane. What's yours is mine." I had always assumed he meant it emotionally. Maybe he didn't. Margaret slid another document toward me. There is one thing I want you to understand. What your father didn't create this trust because he expected you to fight your husband. She paused. He created it because he wanted your future children to have something that no one could take away from them. I looked at Emma. Her little face was peaceful. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. My father had been gone for 8 years. Yet somehow sitting in that office it felt like he had left a hand on my shoulder. I wiped my eyes. What do I do now? Nothing dramatic. Margaret's voice was firm. You document everything. You don't threaten Richard. You don't argue with Patricia. You don't sign anything. And custody. If Richard tries to make claims that you're incapable of caring for Emma, we'll address them properly. I nodded. I wanted to be brave. But the truth was, I was terrified. I had never been to court. I'd never hired an attorney for anything more complicated than settling my father's estate. And now I had a newborn baby and a husband who seemed determined to turn our private life into a legal battle. What if I lose? I asked. Margaret leaned forward. Then we deal with whatever comes next. She didn't promise me an easy victory. That mattered. She wasn't selling me a fairy tale. She was telling me the truth. When I left her office, I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Emma was sleeping in the back seat. I looked at her through the mirror. I don't know how this ends, I whispered. Then my phone buzzed. It was Richard. We need to talk tonight. Mom says you're making this worse. I stared at the message. Then another one came through. Come to dinner. Family only. No lawyers. I almost ignored it. But then I remembered Margaret's advice. Document everything. So I took a screenshot. And I replied with 3 words. I'll be there. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner would be the moment Richard's carefully prepared story began falling apart in front of the very people he had been trying to impress. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was sitting in a private room at a restaurant on the north side of Fort Wayne, trying to balance a newborn in my arms while pretending I wasn't nervous. Richard had chosen the place. It was one of those older American restaurants with dark wood booths, framed photographs of local landmarks, and a carpet that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. I had been there before, usually for birthdays. That night it felt completely different. Richard had called it a family dinner. It wasn't. There were 8 people in the room. Patricia sat at the head of the table. Greg was beside her. Richard sat across from me. 2 of Patricia's cousins were there along with Uncle Harold, Richard's 76-year-old uncle. Harold barely spoke when I walked in. He just nodded at me. I appreciated that. I had Emma in her carrier beside my chair. She was asleep. Patricia looked at her and sighed. You really should have left her with a sitter. I didn't have one. You could have asked me. I looked at her. I don't want Emma separated from me right now. Patricia's mouth tightened. Fine. The waiter came by. I ordered coffee and a bowl of chicken soup. I wasn't hungry. I just knew I needed something in my stomach. Richard didn't order anything. He sat with his hands folded. For a few minutes nobody said much. Then Patricia cleared her throat. We're all here because we care about Emma. I looked at her. Okay, she continued. We think Diane needs some time to recover. Greg nodded. Richard said she's been under a lot of stress. I looked at my husband. You mean giving birth? He didn't smile. I mean everything. I waited. Patricia leaned forward. You've been emotional. I had a baby yesterday. That isn't what I mean. Then what do you mean? She glanced around the table. I mean that you've always had trouble handling pressure. That surprised me. I almost laughed. I'd worked 20 years in bookkeeping. I'd handled payroll during a company merger. I'd helped my mother recover from surgery. I'd managed my father's estate after he died. But apparently changing diapers was where I finally lost my mind. Greg spoke up. Mom isn't saying you're a bad person. No, I said. She's saying I'm a bad mother. Patricia sighed. You're twisting my words. I looked at Richard. Do you believe I'm incapable of caring for Emma? He looked down at the table. Right now, I think you need support. That wasn't my question. He didn't answer. Uncle Harold finally spoke. Richard, answer your wife. Richard looked annoyed. I'm trying to. No, Harold said. You're avoiding it." The room went quiet. Patricia gave Harold a sharp look. "Harold, this is a family matter." "I know." He took a sip of coffee. "That's why I'm listening." I felt something inside me loosen. Just a little. Patricia turned back toward me. "We believe Emma should stay with us temporarily." "No, you keep saying that." "Because my answer hasn't changed." Richard leaned forward. "Diane, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I stared at him. "You left me at the hospital. I told you I needed space. You didn't even call. That doesn't mean I don't care about Emma." "Then why are we having this conversation?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I reached into my purse. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I pulled out a folder. Patricia noticed. "What is that information?" Greg laughed. "Oh, here we go." I looked at him. "Actually, yes, here we go." I placed a printed email on the table. Richard glanced at it. Then he froze. It was almost subtle. If I hadn't been watching him carefully, I might have missed it. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Patricia leaned toward him. "What is it?" Richard didn't answer. I slid the paper across the table. "This is an email you sent to an attorney 4 months ago." Greg picked it up. Richard reached for it. "Don't." He stopped. I looked at him. "You asked about my father's trust." Patricia stared at Richard. "What trust?" He shook his head. "It's nothing." Uncle Harold frowned. "Then why are you sweating?" Richard looked at him. "I am not sweating." Harold pointed toward Richard's forehead. "You're practically shining." For the first time that evening, somebody laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it broke the tension. Richard wiped his forehead with his napkin. I continued. "You wanted to know whether money from my father's trust could become part of our marital assets after Emma was born?" Patricia looked confused. "Richard," he stood up. "You don't understand," I said, "then explain it." He looked around the table. Nobody spoke. Finally he said I was asking a question. "About my money. Our family's money." "No." I shook my head. "My father's money." Patricia suddenly looked at me. "How much?" The question came so quickly that I almost didn't believe I'd heard it. I stared at her. Then I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because after everything we'd been arguing about, that was what she wanted to know, how much Patricia looked embarrassed. "I was just asking." Uncle Harold leaned back. "No, Patricia. You weren't." She turned toward him. "What is that supposed to mean? You've been talking about that money for months." Patricia's face changed. I looked at Harold. "What?" He looked at me. "Your father talked to me before he died," Patricia interrupted. "Harold, don't." But Harold continued. "He told me he didn't want Patricia anywhere near that money." The room became silent. Patricia's face turned red. "You have no right." Harold shook his head. "Maybe not." "But I remember." Richard stood there staring at his uncle. I looked at my husband. "Was this why you wanted Emma?" His face changed. "No." "Was it why your family wanted custody?" "No." "Then why were you asking lawyers about my trust before she was even born?" He couldn't answer. I took a breath. My heart was pounding. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to leave and never look back. But I stayed, because I needed to hear the truth. Richard finally sat down. His voice was quieter. "I thought we could use the money to build a better future." "You mean you thought you could get access to it? That isn't fair." I looked at him. "Neither was what you did to me." Patricia started crying, not loudly, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. She reached for a tissue. We were only trying to protect the baby." I looked at her. "No? You were trying to control the baby?" She shook her head. "You're making a terrible mistake." Maybe I was. But for the first time, the mistake wasn't mine. I picked up Emma's carrier. Richard followed me outside. "Diane," I kept walking, "please." I stopped. He stood on the sidewalk beneath the restaurant's yellow lights. For the first time since Emma was born, he looked frightened. "I don't want to lose you," he said. I looked at him. "You should have thought about that before you decided I wasn't good enough." He lowered his head. I walked to my car. Behind me, Richard didn't follow. He just stood there. And I realized something. The people who had spent days telling me I was powerless had finally discovered that I wasn't. But I also knew the hardest part wasn't over. The next morning, I would have to deal with the consequences, and this time there would be no family dinner to hide behind. The next morning, I woke up at 4:37 a.m. to the sound of Emma crying. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered. The hospital. Richard leaving. His mother telling me I wasn't good enough. The restaurant. The folder. The email. Everything came rushing back. I picked Emma up from her bassinet and sat in the rocking chair beside the window. Outside, Fort Wayne was still dark. A streetlight cast a pale glow across the driveway. I fed her, slowly listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. It was such an ordinary sound, and somehow that ordinary sound made everything feel more real. There was no dramatic music, no courtroom, no miracle. Just me, a tired mother holding her newborn daughter while trying to figure out what my life was going to look like. By 7, I had called Margaret. She answered from her office. "I was expecting to hear from you." "I don't think I slept. That makes 2 of us." I laughed quietly. Then I told her what had happened at the restaurant. She listened. When I finished, she said, "You did the right thing by keeping your voice calm." I didn't feel calm. "You don't have to feel calm to behave calmly." That sentence stayed with me. We went over the next steps. Margaret helped me organize the documents, save the messages Richard had sent, and make sure the trust paperwork was secure. She also reminded me that a family threatening to take a baby and actually having the legal authority to do so were 2 very different things. That distinction mattered, because I had spent the previous 2 days letting their confidence frighten me. They spoke like they had already won. They hadn't. Still, I wasn't suddenly fearless. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my coffee. I wondered whether I should try to save my marriage. Richard had apologized the night before. Not perfectly, not completely, but he had apologized. And despite everything, I still loved the man I thought he was. That was the hardest part. People like to believe leaving is simple when someone hurts you. It isn't. You don't stop loving a person because they disappoint you. You just stop being able to pretend you don't know who they are. Around 10 that morning, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the window. Richard was standing on the porch. Patricia was beside him. I almost didn't open it. Then I remembered something my father used to say. If you don't open the door, people will invent their own version of what happened inside. So I opened it. Richard looked exhausted. Patricia looked smaller than she had the day before. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Patricia said, "Can we come in?" I stepped aside. They entered. Richard looked at Emma's toys on the living room floor. A stuffed rabbit sat beside the couch. A package of diapers was open on the coffee table. Everything looked like a normal home. Maybe that's why Patricia started crying. She covered her face with one hand. "Diane, she said we made a terrible mistake." I didn't answer. Richard sat down. "I did." I looked at him. "Yes, you did," he nodded. "I listened to Mom." Patricia lowered her hand. "Richard." He looked at her. "No, Mom." I did. Then he looked at me. I convinced myself that I was protecting Emma. I said nothing. He continued. "But I was thinking about money." There it was. The sentence I had been waiting to hear. He didn't dress it up. He didn't blame anyone, not at first. "I thought your father's trust could help us," he said. "You mean you thought it could help you?" He nodded. Yes, that honesty hurt more than another lie would have. Patricia sat quietly. Then she whispered, "I was afraid." I looked at her. Of what that Diane would take Emma away from us. I almost smiled. "You were the one trying to take her away from me." Patricia started crying again. I know. There was nothing satisfying about watching her cry. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment many times. I thought I would feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Really tired. I looked at Richard. You left me in a hospital room after I gave birth, I know. You let your family tell me I wasn't fit to raise my own daughter, I know. You didn't correct them. He looked down. I was ashamed. You should have been. He nodded. I am. For a moment the room was silent. Then Patricia said something I didn't expect. Can you forgive me? I looked at her. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn her approval. Christmas dinners, Thanksgiving meals, birthday cards, the little comments she made about my cooking, my clothes, my career. I had always tried to be the daughter-in-law she wanted, and it had never been enough. I finally understood why. I had been trying to earn acceptance from someone who had already decided she wanted control. I can forgive you, I said. Patricia looked up, but that doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. She nodded slowly. Richard wiped his eyes. What does that mean for us? I looked at him for a long time. I don't know, that was the truth. I wasn't ready to decide that day. I wasn't ready to promise reconciliation. I wasn't ready to promise divorce either. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to make a decision because it was right for me, not because somebody else expected it. Richard stood. He walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. I am sorry, I nodded. I believe you. He looked surprised. But I'm still hurt. I understand. Patricia stopped at the doorway. She looked at Emma. Can I see her? I hesitated. Then I nodded. She walked over slowly. She didn't touch Emma. She just stood there. After a few seconds, she whispered, She's beautiful. Yes, I said. She looks like you. I didn't know whether she meant it as a compliment. This time I didn't care. When they left, I locked the door. Then I walked back to the rocking chair. Emma was sleeping peacefully. I sat beside her and looked out the window. I thought revenge was supposed to feel like watching the people who hurt you suffer. It didn't. The real victory was much quieter. It was waking up and realizing I didn't have to beg anyone to recognize my worth. I didn't need Richard's family to approve of me. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their permission to be Emma's mother. What I needed was courage enough to protect the little life sleeping in my arms, and enough honesty to admit that the marriage I'd believed in might not be the marriage I actually had. That night I held Emma close and whispered a promise to her. Not that life would always be easy. I couldn't promise that. Only that I would never teach her to stay where she was treated, as though she had to earn the right to belong. If you've ever had someone underestimate you when you were already carrying more than you thought you could handle, I hope this story reminds you that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like taking a breath, making one phone call, and finally choosing yourself.